So we'll have a look at the first adaptations. Now you've probably heard of this term before, hypertrophy, and if you look at the letters within the word hypertrophy, it gives you an idea of each letter, let's say, is a cell, and as we become more hypertrophic, that is, each individual cell gets bigger, that is, letter gets bigger, and the size of the tissue gets bigger. So that's the definition of hypertrophy: increase in size of tissue or organ due to an increase in size of composite cells. Now, all of us experience physiologic hypertrophy throughout our lives. That is, and it's usually to do with our skeletal muscle. So here, not everybody's like this, of course, but this man here has physiologic hypertrophy, an increase in size of each individual skeletal muscle cell to get an increase in size of tissue. Now, here there is no abnormal function. In fact, it's an increase, better function for lifting things, for instance. So this is purely physiologic hypertrophy. So skeletal muscle, through increased use, we get a physiologic hypertrophy. There's no disease involved. Also cardiac muscle. So if you notice here that skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle in athletes, so let's say long distance, let's say middle distance runners, for instance, the size of their left ventricle actually gets bigger, but their chamber also gets bigger as well. And so again, that is not a pathologic hypertrophy, it's a physiologic hypertrophy, it's normal function. You notice that these two muscle cells, these cells in an adult human cannot divide, that is, the end cells of these muscle cells. And so the only thing they can do is actually increase in size rather than increase in number. So skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, they adapt by increasing in size. Smooth muscle is a little bit different. Yes, you do get hypertrophy of smooth muscle, but in pregnancy you will also get an increase in number. So this is not only a hypertrophy, but as we'll see later, it's also a hyperplasia, which means an increase in size due to increase in number. So we get a mixture in smooth muscle tissue. Here's an example of pathologic hypertrophy. So we just saw physiologic hypertrophy. This is pathologic hypertrophy, and we'll be doing this in the workshop. Now, what we've got here is the left ventricle, and this, and I'll show you, if you follow the arrow, that is the thickness of the wall of the left ventricle. Now, normally, the wall should be around about, I would say, a third of the thickness of that. So this wall has increased in size about 3 times normal. The thing that you'll notice is that the chamber of the heart is quite small. And so what happens is that to increase cardiac output in this person, their heart rate has to increase. And so that, therefore, that puts more stress on the heart and increases the risk of what's called myocardial infarction or heart attack. So what's happening here is that the left ventricle increases in thickness because the pressure within the aorta is very high. That is, our mean arterial pressure has increased, and so the heart, the left side of the heart, has to work harder to pump blood around the body, and therefore you get an increase in thickness of the left ventricle. You'll notice that the right ventricle here, now I haven't got anything to compare with, but that is quite normal. So they haven't got hypertrophy of the right ventricle because there's no resistance pumping blood to the lungs. The other adaptation which everybody would have heard of is atrophy. Atrophy is opposite to hypertrophy in that it's and showing by the cells decreasing in size, and therefore the whole tissue decreasing in size if you go by the letters. So yes, a decrease in size of tissue or organ due to a decrease in the size of the composite cells. Now all of us have experienced this, but you probably don't realize that you have. We have a number of embryonic structures before we are born which go into atrophy, and we are not born with them. And therefore they've gone into what's called physiologic atrophy. But we do experience physiologic atrophy in even just our skeletal muscle. If we don't use them enough, we may reduce the size of the muscle, but it's really not causing a disease of any sort. You may not be as strong as you were, but it's not pathologic. So just by not using it, your skeletal muscles that much, they will get smaller than normal if you were using them correctly. This is pathologic atrophy. This is Alzheimer's disease. So what we're getting is a reduction in the size of the tissue due to reduction in size of, in this particular case, neurons. And as we'll see with Alzheimer's disease is largely a genetic disease where you get a deposition of substances within neurons, and that causes their atrophy, and eventually it will cause death. Now, and I'll emphasize here that atrophy does not necessarily mean death of the cells or the tissue. Cells can adapt and can stay in a small size, but sometimes, say in the case of Alzheimer's, the cells not only atrophy, they can also die as well. This is an interesting situation here where we have a set of testicles from the same individual. The one on the left here is a normal sized testicle, and the one on the right has obviously reduced in size. And my question normally is, what do you expect is happening here? That is, to this testicle on the right. As it says here, testicle on the right is atrophied. Now, if I put the question to you, is it hormonal? And you should come back to me and say, no, Brian, it isn't hormonal, because if it was hormonal, that is a lack of hormones, then this testicle on the left would also atrophy at the same rate as the one on the right. So you might be thinking, okay, well, what is causing this atrophy? The answer is I don't know, but the real possibility is a reduced blood flow to this testicle. It could also mean a reduced nerve supply to the testicle, but my hazard guess would be that for some reason there's a reduction in blood supply to this particular testicle to reduce in size. So this is a pathologic atrophy of the testes. So as it says here, there are at least 8 ways pathologic atrophy can occur, and you can probably think of them now, and we're going to reveal them. You might want to jot these down. So the first way is a decrease in nutrition. So if you reduce the amount of, say, remember, nutrition doesn't necessarily mean actually eating something. It can also be nutrition as far as blood supply, which doesn't necessarily also mean oxygen. It can be other nutrients as well. So if we have a reduction in nutrients to tissue, whether it be via an oral intake or via a delivery of nutrients via the blood, well, then tissue can adapt by getting smaller. The other obvious one is a decrease in workload, but in a pathological sense. So we decrease the workload to the point where the muscle, say muscle atrophies at a really enormous rate, as well as cardiac muscle, for instance, and we'll see this particularly in elderly individuals where the workload is decreased in the muscle to get atrophy, and in this particular case you will have a degree of, say, cell death as well. The other obvious way is a lack of innervation. So individuals that, say, are paraplegic or quadriplegic with lack of nerve supply to muscles, well, then the tissue will adapt by getting smaller. The one that we just talked about before is a decrease in blood supply, and we defined the term ischemia in the first video, in the intro video. So this is a reduction in blood supply to a tissue organ. So the cells can adapt by getting smaller. Remember, they don't have to die, but they could possibly die as well if the ischemia is very, very great. The one we mentioned before, hormonal stimulation. For instance, if there's a lack of hormonal stimulation, say via FSH or LH, in regards to stimulating either ovaries or testes to function normally, well then, if we have a reduction in those hormones for some reason, then say ovaries and testes may atrophy, and they will atrophy uniformly in both testes and ovaries. So hormonal stimulation is also important, or a decrease in hormonal stimulation is also an important way in which we can cause atrophy in tissues. One way in which we can cause atrophy in tissue is an unusual way. It's called pressure atrophy. And this is basically when a structure presses on another tissue. And it is some way a atrophy that reduces the nutrition to that particular tissue. So something like a benign tumor can press up against another tissue to cause it to atrophy, and it is depriving the tissue of nutrients. It doesn't have to be a benign tumor, it can be other large structures just pressing on other tissues to cause atrophy in that tissue. Aging, the thing about aging, it's not a disease in itself, but as we age, tissues get smaller via hormonal, via decrease in workload, and via other mechanisms as well. So aging, and it's the aging process, causes atrophy of virtually all tissues within the body. The final one is associated with genetically caused atrophy, and something like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, where there is a gene missing and therefore a protein missing that causes atrophy within skeletal muscle. The one we saw before with Alzheimer's disease is that is a genetic disease, increasing the likelihood of atrophy due to deposition of certain proteins within neurons. So there we have it. We have 8 ways in which we can get atrophy, and that is pathological atrophy.